So we're going to talk about NatureFix today and how nature connection amplifies our well-being. I just want to start by saying, well, why are we doing this? And it's because we believe that improving our everyday connection is important for human health and it's important for planetary health. It's not just a one-way thing about us. It also helps us care more as well. And if we just, again, cast our mind back, if we were to put human history into a 24-hour day, starting at midnight at one day and finishing at midnight the other day, about 8 o'clock in the morning, we would have been developing anatomically as humans up for the first night, and then about 8 o'clock in the morning we woke up as humans on this coastline. This was our homepage, the homepage for the human mind. And the discoveries at Pinnacle Point date back to about 8 to 9 a.m. in the morning. And that's when we woke up as humans. We discovered symbolic expression, creativity, problem solving. We started to understand this idea of culture. Now, for the whole of the human day, we were on this coastline, basically. And the first humans left about midday. Greater migrations went out about 2 in the afternoon. The people that stayed became known as the Sand. Humans reached Australia about 5 o'clock in the evening. 5:30 into China, Europe around about 8 p.m. They interbred with Neanderthals who became extinct soon after. Not sure why exactly, a few reasons. Only at about 5 to 11 at night did we start to domesticate livestock, did we discover agriculture. At around about 11:30, some big changes came. The Yamaya culture descended from the steppe of Eurasia, came through Europe. Thereafter was the first city, the Bronze Age, around about 1133. 1145 at night, Gautama Buddha came on the stage. A few minutes later, Jesus did. A few minutes later, Muhammad did. Then around about 10 to midnight, the Khoi Khoi came into South Africa. About 1154, Mapungubwe was built up in Limpopo. 1155, the big tree here sprung up. 1156, Admiral Zhang sailed with about 27 ships and 30,000 crew from China all throughout Africa. 90 years later, 1 minute later, not even, Columbus tried the same with 3 ships. They broke down, they had to go back, had to try again, didn't quite discover America. But we don't really hear about Admiral Zhang's effort, just as an aside. Bartholomew Diaz came around about 1158, Industrial Revolution, just after that, 1159, most of megafauna along the garden route disappeared. And only in these last 30 seconds, we've used more resources than we used in the previous 24-hour day. Now, there's a lot to that, but the main point I wanted to make with that is just actually that 97% of human history, we actually lived as egalitarian foragers. At least 97%. Human history keeps going back. So our neurophysiology is actually primed for certain kinds of experiences, both how we relate together as people and what we do with nature. So humans are remarkably adaptable, but it comes at a cost. So, and that cost we're seeing nowadays. We've got the human species isn't doing so well. I won't go through all the reasons, but on many different levels, as humans, we are struggling and we are not doing so well. And on the back of all that, we're losing our biodiversity. We've got climatic things. The real point I want to make here is it's a convergence of crisis, is the first point. The second point is shifting baselines. Shifting baselines comes from the idea, comes out of fisheries, where with each generation we accept what is a good, each generation our tolerance of what's a good catch changes. And so that also applies to our psychology and our sense of connection. What is an acceptable level of connection with nature? What is acceptable well-being? What is acceptable biodiversity? And that's shifting with each generation. So a study in The Lancet, which is a prestigious medical journal, was saying that we've got about 1 billion people suffering from mental disorder in 2020. $1 trillion costs the global economy. 30% of adults in the Anglophonic countries, at least, are struggling or distressed. They reckon mental health will be the #1 contributor to disease by 2030. And 50% of 18 and 24-year-olds are saying they're also distressed and struggling. So our urban areas are becoming epicenters for chronic mental health conditions. In South Africa, a study in 2022 found that we had the lowest mental health quotient out of the 34 countries surveyed, only 46% from the metric that they use. And there are a lot of respondents there, about 220,000 from 34 countries, 12,000 from South Africa. The calls per day to the South African Depression and Anxiety Group helpline have gone up remarkably, 600 in 2019, 1,400 in the middle of COVID, and now we're up 3,000. You know, it's still increasing. And that's just calls. There's still hundreds more emails, SMS, WhatsApps looking for support. What are the drivers and trends? Well, there's probably a multitude, but this report from Sapien Labs looked at all these different countries and regions, and they found 4 big things that flagged: the environmental decline and the increase of toxins, political instability, income inequality. The one thing that correlated across all countries in time was the rise in internet and social media. We would add a 5th one there, and that is also now the rise of eco-anxiety and climate distress, about extreme climatic events and so forth. So 50 years of research is showing that our urban areas are becoming epicenters for chronic non-communicable disease, and modern medicine is struggling to keep up with that. So it's getting worse in the wake of COVID, in the wake of now wars and climatic events. So what's the option? Well, the one thing that research is showing is that nature, and many of us would know this, it has profound effects on health and well-being. Now, that might be intuitively, you might get that from personal experience, but there's been a lot of science behind that, and it's proliferating. The studies have been coming out for the last decade or two, looking at the benefits of interacting with nature, research on how nature contact helps health, the health benefits of greenness, World Health Organization looking at green and blue space for mental health, nature, biodiversity and health. It's just non-stop. And many of these are reviews. So there's also been big reports like this, which got a lot of coverage internationally, about 120 minutes, 2 hours a week outside as good health and well-being, equates to good health and well-being. If you don't get that, you didn't get the benefits. If you're way past that, the benefits weren't that much more. It seemed to be a hard limit. But this was only a study in the UK. A lot of participants, almost 20,000, but just the UK. Then you have reports like these, which are reviews, and now all these are all the other papers which have been finding benefits. And this was a review of reviews. And these are all the benefits for looking at contact with human nature here on the side. I'm not going to go through them right now. We'll see it in the coming slides. But basically, it's getting to the point of what does nature not help, as opposed to what it does help. Scientists then look at the pathways and say, well, how is this working? Okay, we have exposure to nature. Possibly we would call it our dose. And that can change in terms of proximity, duration, frequency. And then what are the mechanisms there? Is it improved air quality, negative ions? Is it reduced heat, cool, shade? Is it feeling less fatigued? Is it the perception, the sensory perception that we're getting? The physical activity in those spaces? And then they look at the states which that induces. So relaxation, awe, vitality, increased immune function, cognition, more creativity, clearer mind, attention restoration, so less mental fatigue, less dopamine, and it goes on. And then there's these longer term health outcomes, and all the minuses there are the ones which is reducing, and then plus, and this is not definitive, there's many more, but like reducing ADHD, anxiety, depression, diabetes, so forth, increasing sleep, social bonds and mood, and plus or minus is allergies, asthma, that can go both ways. So this is another way of just showing that you know, nature improves our mental health, our physical health, and our planetary health. By planetary health, it also promotes conservation behaviours, more actions on climate change, and also care for others in our community. And there's also other ones that I didn't mention before, like better eyesight. That's a big one. There's an epidemic of myopia in Southeast Asia, and there's been very good evidence to show that the increase in wearing of glasses in Southeast Asia is screen time, number one thing. So it's simple, but it's not simplistic. There are a range of theories which support this. I won't go into these in detail, but just so you know that there are people behind this looking at attention restoration theory, stress reduction theory, nervous system regulation, environmental condition, immune system regulation, and the biophilia hypothesis, which is what I was saying, that we are sort of predisposed to affiliate with nature based on our evolutionary history. So the World Health Organization said in 2017 already that in one of their reports that green space can deliver positive health, social, environmental outcomes, and very few, if any, other public interventions can do all of this, especially for active lifestyles, mental well-being, and social interactions. So it seems like it's a no-brainer. But here's the thing, it's not just contact with nature, it's the nature of the contact. So it's not just the contact of nature, it's the nature of the contact. So it's got to be more than just a walk in the park. And this is the difference I really want to bring out in this presentation, because some very interesting neuroscience research has looked not just at nature here, but actually with built environments, like this room, for example, that it's about the exposure, but it's also about the effort that you put in. So you can be in a lovely environment, but if you're not putting in the effort to notice, to appreciate or to engage, the benefits from whatever you build internally or externally are not all there. And often people need to be guided in to be able to notice, because we're stuck in our sensory ruts. So we have these ruts and habitual patterns of what we notice. We pattern all the time. This is another thing about evolutionary history, about why we pattern and how we pattern. But sometimes we have to be helped out of those ruts and patterning. So, and by the way, if it was just about time in nature, then everyone with an outdoor job should be flourishing, and we know that's not the case. So there's something there that we have to be mindful of. A couple of metaphors here. If you tell me you're going to the gym, there's an assumption that you're not just going to walk in and look at a treadmill, touch some weights, have a wander around, and leave. The assumption is that you're actually going to engage, and you might be doing a specific routine for your body type. You may even have somebody like a personal trainer helping you. So when we say we're going into nature, what does that mean? What's the assumption there? How are we engaging? So it's useful to sometimes make those parallels. The other thing, the other metaphor that I think is important to notice, and some very good research coming out of the UK about this, is opportunity versus orientation. So opportunity relates to access. So a lot of governments are saying we have to increase access to nature, let's increase access. Fantastic. But if you're not oriented towards going into nature or have an interest, then the access doesn't make much difference. A very interesting study out of Brisbane, where I grew up, showing that. It didn't matter how close the parks were, if you weren't predisposed, you weren't necessarily using them. And so the metaphor here is a party. The door of the party might be open, but if you're not comfortable going in, you can walk in at any moment, but if you're anxious going in, if you don't feel comfortable, if you just don't want to, then, you may as well, the door may as well be shut. So then what's, and this then comes to this idea of nature connection. Well, what is it? Well, part of my doctoral research through Stellenbosch about a decade ago looked at this, and definitions are something that's so personal are tricky, but we came up with this idea that it's this state of awareness that brings together our thoughts, our feelings, our direct experiences with nature, that supports traits. Now, traits are enduring things. It's not just a fleeting state, but traits are something that lasts. And those traits reinforce our everyday actions, which reflect our relationship with the rest of nature, because we are nature. So I don't want to create this just separation. We're very clear that it's the rest of nature, it's that we are part of nature. Now, I spoke about all the studies involved with nature contact in human health already. The studies in nature connection, as being distinct from contact, have also proliferated over the last few years. And it's finding something very interesting, and we call this the nature connection advantage. It is bringing together benefits which are not just with contact alone. And one of those is happiness. There's a distinct form of happiness that people who are more connected with nature seem to show above contact with nature. And as I already said, if it was just about time in nature, then everyone with an outdoor job would be happy. Connection has a particular role on our emotional and nervous system regulation. So you can still be in nature, and you could be gunning it on your mountain bike or you're getting to the next point. Now, nothing wrong with that. That has a lot of benefits. But we could still be in the dopamine treadmill. Our lives are just on this. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic nervous system is the joy, the activation, the go, let's go. Being busy can feel good because it's activating our dopamine. It's activating our hunter mind in a way. And then we have the adrenaline and the cortisol, your fight or flight. That's activated in our lifestyles all the time. These were always activated in our bodies, but they were always peaks, and they were then back self-regulate. They were counter-regulated. What counter-regulated them? Slowing down, sitting under the tree, having a siesta, being back in community with the timelessness. That activates our parasympathetic nervous system. It's the rest and digest. It releases oxytocin, which is the same drug that mothers give, same chemical that mothers naturally produce during childbirth. And we need that to self-regulate. Nature connection has an ability to do that other things don't. Eudemonic wellbeing. Studies out of the UK have found that the sense of a worthwhile life nature connection is a far bigger predictor for that. In the UK, in the study they did there, it was 4 times more likely to be a predictor for this idea of eudemonic well-being, which is meaningful, worthwhile life, than socioeconomic status. So that's quite substantial. It might not be the case in South Africa, I'm sure it's not. But the fact that it was such a big difference, that it mattered more to people for their well-being than wealth, financial wealth, was significant. Pro-social and pro-nature behaviours. Connection over and above contact motivates us to care and actually do something for nature in return. And it turns out that it also makes us a nicer people. We tend to be more altruistic towards others. And it's a key leverage point in sustainability interventions. They're finding that if you work with connection, you can have these sustainability outcomes. So how do we improve it? Well, there's been some meta-analyses, and again, just for those who aren't aware, that's a review of reviews. So it's not just a single study out of somewhere. It's when someone says, let's look at all the studies and make sure that they tell us something. They do, and that's direct contact and mindfulness in nature, and that it has to be targeted, regular, long-term interventions. Everyday stuff, not just jumping out into see the bird for once a year for 3 days. Wonderful, fantastic, has a load of benefits, but it doesn't necessarily inculcate connection. Interestingly, conventional environmental education was not found to be significant. And that's kind of a wake-up call for many of us, including myself, who've been involved in that space. You know, how do we transform that so that it also inculcates education? And I'll come to a moment about part of what that is. So nature connectionists can have increased more pro-nature behaviours, and people who are more highly connected seem to be healthier than those with low nature connection. This is not fringe stuff anymore. When I finished my PhD, it did feel like that. I remember the first time I presented some of my work at the FAMOS Forum, and you had tended to have a few people afterwards who congregate around and said, that was fantastic, I've been meaning to hear this for a long time. A lot of people left, and I even had a few people who were quite hostile towards me. In fact, I remember a lady from Sandparks was very hostile for me that I said that I should suggest this, and maybe make an inference that some of us in conservation are not as connected as we think we might be. So I didn't say that, but I think that's how she was maybe implying it. But we've come a long way, and this is now on the agenda. Last year, a report commissioned by the European Environmental Agency, hardly fringe, concluded in one of the concluding paragraphs that our relationship with nature needs redefining from one of extraction to one of care. Our connection should be strengthened in our social norms and value systems and how we live our everyday lives. So it needs to be mainstreamed. So some of the pathways for that, there are quite a few. Thanks. I'm still getting over that cough that seems to go over that everyone's been having. So some of the pathways is noticing with our senses, and these have been validated in certain contexts. Seeking out beauty and appreciating that, allowing emotions to come into what we do, and that might always be positive emotions. It can be grief. There's nothing wrong with that. Finding meaning, looking at the symbolism, insights, and stories. Moving the body, like making sure that we actually engage with hands-on stuff, nature skills, somatic practices. Giving gratitude. The science of gratitude, independent of its relationship with nature, is also huge now. It's no longer fringe. Gratitude is good and it's very helpful in many ways. But particularly gratitude of how we're helped by nature on a daily basis is important. Remembering reciprocity, it's not just a one-way street. So nurturing nature, tending the wild, planting, care and compassion, all those sorts of things. And sharing our experiences with others. There's no point being a sociopathic naturalist. It's important to engage. a big part of nature connection in our evolutionary history was the fact we did it in community. Groups this size coming in from a day of foraging, hunting, sharing, celebrating the harvest. That's incredibly important. Sharing the stories of the hunt, all those sorts of things. It might change now. I'm not saying we have to go back to that, but just think of the cues that made that work. And we have to allow some spaciousness. Spaciousness, it shouldn't just be on a time limit. Allow yourself to wander without having to get back. Playfulness. Just because we're adults, it doesn't mean we can't play, and creativity. So it's the moments that matter most. That's what it's coming down to. The moments, not just the minutes. And the moments of connection seem to matter more than the time in nature, seem to matter more than knowledge about nature, which is what I was saying about conventional environmental education. A certain amount of knowledge is necessary, obviously. It's not saying it's all bad, but there's a limit there. And more than just access to nature, as I've already alluded to. It's access and orientation, opportunity and orientation. So it comes down to how we design nature, particularly in urban environments, what elements are conducive to our evolutionary mind. Having the contact, having the chance for this exposure, but then also the connection, which is the active engagement. And if we can line those up, we can start to see these pro-nature and pro-wellbeing outcomes. So with NatureFix, we went on a mission. We said, well, if contact is good and connection's better, how do we encourage people to notice, appreciate, and relate to nature as part of their everyday engagement? How can we nudge people out of their sensory ruts and routines, and how can we scale it? Not everybody can just dial up a forest bathing guide or something like that, what can we do? So that's when NatureFix came into the picture. It started during COVID. There were municipalities in Australia wanting to do more for their constituents, realising they were struggling, and said, we're seeing them go to the park a lot more. Can we do more? And we said, well, we've got a few ideas on that. And then we engaged with a few councils, as they call them over there, municipalities. It started with signage. Then in places where signage was okay, but then it extended, and then people were like, well, signage isn't always appropriate. So then, ironically, it went to an app. But I'll tell you why we think it's a little bit different. Because the thing about what we've got here is that it's self-guided audio, and it responds to your geolocation. So interestingly, the IT guy who we work with on this, he's a Kiwi. He had got to a point in his life where he'd been doing IT and said, so much of my IT work started great, and if I followed its trajectory, by the end, it was bad. And he wanted to really rethink his IT. And so he actually started working with museums in New Zealand, having this geolocation technology where you would have an exhibit explained in a museum, or you go to a Maori heritage site and have the stories of the Maoris relayed. And so we said, look, fantastic fit, let's see if we can do it for here. And so what we do is we have these geolocated points, and when you go to those points, you can listen, you can pull out your screen and read it. We encourage you to try to not do that, at least after a while. And you can listen, and then you're guided through an exercise that we have got evidence base to help induce certain states, less stress, attention restoration, and so forth. And then as you have these days, a bit of the gamification is to encourage you, like you're on a roll, let's keep going. How many meaningful moments have you had this week? And there's also standalone activities which you can do anywhere. You don't have to do them here in the valley. You can do those standalone activities anywhere you want, and that's the solo section. So my role has been around the research, making sure that the routines that we've been developing, we call them routines, you can call them exercises, practices, but are backed by evidence. So, for example, we know, breathing slowly and belly breathing certainly induces the parasympathetic nervous system. But what you may not know is relaxing the eyes. So we have two different types of attention and vision, narrow and broad. We're very much in the Western mind narrow focused. We don't pull back a lot. And if you can invoke your wide angle vision, your parasympathetic nervous system switches on very quickly. And so some of these activities are about that, working with your parasympathetic nervous system, wide angle vision. Focusing on fractals, researchers show that if you look at the fractal parts in nature, in ferns, in the eddies of water, in clouds, it has the same effect on the mind as classical music does in terms of lowering stress states. So that's what we're doing here, saying, well, how can we work with this? In Australia, we've installed already in a number of green spaces around hospitals, mainly for the staff, actually, was the request. Parks and botanical gardens, workplaces, university campus, and also now, I'll get to this a bit later, but there's a conservation organisation in Australia, which is very much volunteer driven, has been suffering burnout and eco-grief and anxiety. So we did a 30-day program with them where we gave them exercises online. They were 5 or 10 minutes a day, and then they would go out and do exercises. And it was very encouraging. The other aspect that which has really been working is with Indigenous engagement, First Nations, Indigenous engagement, and also minority groups, so new immigrants in Australia. But with the Indigenous engagement, we had the elders speak the stories of country when people entered into a space. What was the cultural stories of this area? And we had them sort of record the recordings, and then you would listen to that, and they'd have their own invitations. With the minority groups, we had it translated into languages I've actually never heard of, embarrassingly, but different Middle Eastern languages. Swahili was one of them, from all the new immigrants arriving to Australia, to help them to get into a place that they could feel comfortable as well. We've worked with the Macquarie University Living Lab, and that's a research program that has been on their campus working with students to make sure that this is working. And we've done it a few years now to look at the benefits, and we use psychometric scales. I won't go into what they are, but self-report and other tests to try to gauge, mood, mood levels, nature connection, attention restoration, and so forth. Here's a little clip which came out of one of our first programs we did with those students. One of the key things that comes out of me for that clip is this idea of, again, what I spoke about earlier with that metaphor of the party, is opportunity and orientation. And I also do quite a bit of outdoor guiding, and one of the things I always need to say at the beginning is, can you give yourself permission? Can you allow yourself permission to sit under a tree, to take some time out, to maybe awaken your inner child again? And the same with these students. Quite a few of them, the ones that he came there very adamant, arrogant, that it was not going to do any good. Another one, the fact is they had to do it. They had to do it because, I don't know how we recruited in the end, whether it was volunteer who wants to do it, but it was part of the university day. And so, that they went through it. And I think this is a key thing, is how do we invite people to walk through that door for the first time at that party? And how do we make them feel welcome once we're into that party? So the results, as my colleague Miles alluded to, was, reporting between before and after, 38% happier, 20% less negative, 30% more connected, 20% more appreciative of place. Place making and being connected to place is critical, and it's something we really hope for here as well, because I can remember during lockdown, I was living in a flat in Plet. We had this, a little bit of green space at the back. Lucky enough to have that, but it was minimal. But my vivid memories of that space, because that's all I had, were incredible. And my best memories of actually that green patch were then. And so inviting people to notice, because I noticed, and I had some tools to learn how to notice, but place making, having a sense of place is critical. And this student at the end said, the campus became a sense of place more than just a university to study, not just textured wallpaper to walk through to get to your building, but actually had meaning. And so the more that we've been doing this, we're starting to see, in addition to the evidence that says what it's supposed to do, we're seeing at the other end, when students or participants do these routines, they're reporting these things in our self-report. Like after doing the bird routine, they're feeling more relaxed or calm and so forth. So we've got a database now of about 50 different activities, and we can start to see what they're better for. This has led to my other work, and this is a fusion between NatureFix and what I'm doing with Kwendalo, and this is this idea of nature prescriptions. And it's been getting quite a lot of traction around the world, and it's this idea of a complementary nature-based intervention that healthcare professionals can use to formally recommend nature to help alleviate low mood, anxiety, depression, obesity and diabetes, and promote a whole lot of other health outcomes. In speaking with the GPs that I've spoken to in Plet, they would say at least 30% of people coming through their door at the moment, it's about distress, struggling, it's mental stuff, and it's not something that they are willing to prescribe for or has much effect to. So The media, in the UK at least, about during COVID, it was announced that they were going to support these green prescriptions. It's also been happening in North America. There's quite a long history. I won't go into it now. In Australia, these headlines came out last year, where they're looking at, it's time to consider time for doctors to consider a nature prescription for all the benefits I've mentioned. And there's been some trials and pilots around the world. I'm just going to show one of them here. They've all been positive, but this one was done in Scotland, funded by the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. And they found that afterwards, 80% of patients felt that their GPs should be doing more with nature for their health. Most patients didn't have any problems following a nature prescription. 74% of patients said they benefited from it. 87% of patients said it was likely or very likely they would continue doing what they were invited to do as part of their prescription. And just before the pilot, only about 40% of GPs would ever consider doing something like that. But by the end, 90% were saying that they would continue with prescribing nature given the benefits they saw for their patients. Something I want to say on that? I think it was. That's what I want to say. So this is nature-based activities. We're not prescribing a herbal tea, fantastic as well, but there is sometimes confusion. This is nature-based activities, either alone or in social groups. Former colleague of mine, John O'Reeves, works with the Wetland and Wildfowl Trust in the UK, and they were part of a blue prescribing project looking at the value of their wetlands for health. And they did a fascinating pilot where through their surveys afterwards, they found there was an increase in mental wellbeing, decrease in anxiety, decreased in perceived stress, increased in positive affect and mood. And what they did, which was particularly interesting, was they looked at the economic benefit with some economic modelling. And it was thought the benefit of this wetlands on wellbeing and these prescriptions were 4 times what you were getting from arts and sport, which usually gets the money. So that was very interesting. They also did interviews with their participants, and they verbally in focus interviews talked about having reduced anxiety, depression, long-term symptom management, reduced social isolation, confidence to be in nature, and improved physical health. Why? Some of the things it looks like is that they could relate to the cycles and seasons of nature. As humans, we also go through our cycles and seasons of our mood and so forth, and that was something that they found meaningful. Managing change as nature would, just getting away from their usual ruts, the sense of being away in a group, developing a deeper attachment to one place, coming again, noticing new things each time they hadn't seen before, and the group cohesion, relating with peers in a similar environment. And so this is the underpinning for nature referrals that we're doing through the Kwendalo Institute, and we're hoping to launch the pilot this quarter. We're already on our way toward that, and it's bringing together prescribers. So we're working with 4 healthcare professionals in Plet for the pilot, a number of providers, people who actually lead outdoor activities, like Kai Haynes at the back there on the Robberg, that will feature, and also patients as well. So patients who are willing to be open to being prescribed a nature-based activity. So it's often group-based and social, and it's the idea of cultivating healthy personal relationships with a locally accessible place in nature. And it has, as I mentioned, has intrapersonal outcomes for the individual, interpersonal in terms of how one relates to each other, and environmental outcomes. Around the world, there's been a difference in how this has been done. In the US and Canada, at least what you tend to see is like the doctor says, here, go to a national park, off you go. More or less. There's a very good TED talk of a lady in the US who does it differently, who's working with minority groups and actually kind of guided them into nature. But what's being promoted is not really monitoring that. In the UK, the government funded for a part of time this idea called link workers or community connectors, somebody who met the patient and then said, let's go to Nature's Valley Trust and do a bird count, or let's go and monitor shorebirds, or whatever it is. We feel here, but given that we can't expect government funding anytime soon and various things, we have to be a little bit different in how we think about this, and we've got some ideas to how to make that work, but we feel it needs to be all 3. So there can be the self-prescription that people do by themselves, there can be one where there's somebody interfacing, and then we have the digital one where you can do it, but you're guided through NatureFix. So that's how we see it intermeshing. And then just to finish up, this was a workshop we had at Kwendalo a couple of months ago, where we brought together, it was a whole day workshop looking at how this could work, what it involved, what we need to think about as providers of nature, bringing together prescribers and providers to say, how can we make this work? So that's to be continued, and watch this space. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to field any questions, and I can be contacted by those ways. Cheers.
Right. Thanks.